The galaxy was old, and it believed it had seen everything. 900 years of peace had made the great civilizations of the galactic concord slow and comfortable, like fat creatures resting after a long meal. And they had forgotten what it meant to be afraid. They had forgotten what war truly looked like, and they had certainly forgotten that the most dangerous things in the universe were not always the loudest. 42 species governed known space from the great orbital citadel of Valith Prime, a station so enormous that it had its own weather systems and its own gravity wells. And within its shining halls, the elder races walked with pride and confidence, believing that nothing in the cosmos could ever challenge them again. Among those elder races, the Vathari stood tallest, literally and politically, their crystalline skin catching the light of 1,000 chandeliers as they moved through the diplomatic corridors with the grace of creatures who had ruled for millennia. And at the head of their delegation sat Ambassador Revik Solon, chairman of the Concord Security Council, a being of sharp intelligence and sharper prejudice, though he would never have admitted to the second quality. Then there were the Kethvori, an insectoid species whose hive strategic minds made them the finest military planners in known space. And their Fleet Marshal Doron commanded the Concord Combined Fleet with the calm certainty of someone who had never once doubted that his forces were sufficient for any threat. And then, far below these great powers, sitting in the cheapest seats at the back of every assembly hall and living in the smallest quarters on the station, there were the humans. Humanity had joined the Concord 130 years ago after a brief border conflict that the elder races preferred to call a misunderstanding. A small war that ended quickly when the humans agreed to terms and smiled politely and accepted their place at the bottom of the galactic hierarchy as a Tier 6 civilization, which was a diplomatic way of saying they were considered barely worth noticing. The humans had one ship in Concord core space, a modest diplomatic frigate called the TFS Gentle Horizon, captained by a woman named Alara Jin, who was exactly the kind of human the galaxy expected: calm, professional, polite, and completely unremarkable in every way that mattered. Captain Jin attended briefings where no one asked her opinion, stood at receptions where no one remembered her name, and filed reports that no one read. And she did all of this with a patience that would have impressed a stone. On this particular day, the Concord was preparing for its grandest celebration, the 900th anniversary of the Treaty of Lasting Peace, the document that had ended the last great galactic war and bound the species together in cooperation. And every delegation was expected to contribute to the festivities, though humanity's contribution was limited to a small cultural display in a hallway that most delegates used as a shortcut to the restrooms. Ambassador Solon stood at the center of the Grand Chamber and gave a speech about unity and strength and the enduring power of civilization. And the assembled delegates applauded with genuine pride, because they truly believed that nothing could threaten what they had built. But in the corridors outside the celebration, quieter conversations were happening. 3 colony worlds on the outer rim had gone silent in the past 60 days. No communications, no distress signals, just silence, as if someone had simply erased them from existence. And the intelligence reports that trickled in spoke of massive energy signatures and unknown ship configurations, and a name that made the border species nervous: the Reshkari Dominion. Fleet Marshal Doron had raised the issue in a closed session of the Security Council, presenting sensor data and requesting full fleet mobilization. But the elder races had dismissed his concerns with the comfortable logic of those who had been safe for too long. The border was far away, the colonies were minor, and surely it was pirates, or a natural disaster, or some other explainable thing. Doron had accepted the decision with the discipline of a soldier, but his compound eyes had darkened in a way that his aides recognized as deep frustration. In the human section of Valith Prime, a small cluster of rooms that smelled faintly of coffee and determination. Captain Jin sat alone in her quarters when her personal terminal chimed with a message on a communication channel that did not officially exist. The encryption was Terran military, 7 layers deep, routed through ghost satellites that the Concorde did not know about, and the message itself was short. Just a few words, and a code that Jin had memorized years ago, but never expected to actually receive. She read it once, then twice, then deleted it so thoroughly that not even the atoms that had stored it could remember what it said. Her expression did not change, it never did, but something behind her eyes shifted, like a light turning on in a room that had been dark for a very long time. She stood, straightened her uniform, and walked to a section of the station where a woman named Yuan kept an office that was officially listed as an archival research suite, but was actually something far more interesting. Archivist Yuan was small and quiet, and wore glasses that she did not need, because the glasses contained scanning equipment that could read documents through walls, and she had spent 15 years on Valith Prime, watching and listening and learning everything the Concorde did not want outsiders to know. When Jin entered, Yuan was sitting at her desk, surrounded by data tablets, and she looked up with eyes that were already expecting this. "Visit. You received it," Yuan said, not a question. Jin nodded once. "The border colonies are gone," Jin said, "and the Concorde is doing nothing, and the Reshkari are coming deeper into civilized space with every passing week." Yuan leaned back in her chair and folded her hands, and for a long moment the two women simply looked at each other, sharing the weight of something enormous and secret and terrifying and necessary. "They have authorized it," Yuan said quietly, and her voice carried the gravity of a sentence that had been waiting to be spoken for over a century. "Wake her up." Jin closed her eyes for just a moment, and when she opened them again, there was something new in them. Not fear, not excitement, but the steady resolve of someone who understood that the universe was about to change. She turned and walked out of the room, without another word, her boots clicking against the polished floor of Valith Prime, passing alien diplomats who did not look at her, and guards who did not notice her, and delegates who would not have cared about her, even if they had. And that was exactly how the humans wanted it, because for 130 years, humanity had been smiling and nodding and sitting in the cheap seats and accepting every insult with grace, and not once, not a single time, had any species in the Galactic Concorde thought to ask the most important question of all. Why were the humans so calm? Why, in a galaxy full of proud and powerful civilizations that fought and postured and displayed their strength at every opportunity, did the humans alone seem perfectly content to be underestimated? The answer to that question was waking up right now, in the cold dark between stars, in a place that appeared on no map and existed in no database, where something vast and patient and terrible had been sleeping for a very, very long time. And the galaxy, in its comfort and its pride and its 900 years of peace, had absolutely no idea what was coming. The Reshkari came to Sci-Fi Reach on a Tuesday, though the people who lived there would never again care what day it was. Sci-Fi Reach was a garden world, green and olden and full of life, home to 2 billion souls who farmed its rich soil and fished its warm oceans, and raised their children under skies that had never known the shadow of a warship. And it was exactly the kind of place that made conquerors hungry. The Concorde Border Patrol assigned to the system consisted of 46 ships, elegant and advanced, crewed by officers who had trained for war, but never truly expected to fight one. When their long-range sensors detected 1,200 unknown vessels dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, most of them simply stared at their screens in disbelief. Warlord Kaelzer stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Reshkari dreadnought Burning Tide, and watched the tiny Concorde patrol ship scramble into a defensive. Formation with the amusement of a predator watching small animals pretend to be brave. He was enormous, even by Reshkari standards. His biometallic exoskeleton scarred from 100 battles, his 4 eyes burning with the cold fire of a being who had personally conquered 11 civilizations and added their bones to his throne room. And he looked at the Concorde ships the way a hammer looks at glass. "Destroy them," he said, and his voice carried no anger and no excitement, only the flat certainty of someone performing a task beneath his abilities. The battle lasted 37 minutes. The Concorde ships fought bravely, there was no question of that. But bravery was not enough against 1,200 warships built for nothing but destruction, and one by one the patrol vessels were torn apart, their elegant hulls cracking open like eggs, their distress signals screaming into the void until there was no one left to scream. Sci-Fi Reach fell within hours, and 2 billion people learned what it meant to be conquered by a species that viewed mercy as weakness. Back on Valith Prime, the first distress signals arrived like a punch to the stomach. Ambassador Solon was in his private chambers when his aide burst through the door with a face the color of ash. And within minutes, the Security Council was convened in an emergency session that crackled with fear and confusion and the terrible realization that the galaxy they knew was breaking apart. 3 systems, Fleet Marshal Duran reported, his compound eyes scanning the tactical display that floated above the council table like a map of catastrophe. Sci-Fi Reach, the Corvani Belt, and Thune Minor, all hit within the same rotation, all overwhelmed, all gone. The chamber erupted in voices, 42 species talking over each other, demanding answers, assigning blame, and doing everything except the one thing that mattered, which was acting quickly. Solon raised his crystalline hands for silence, and got something close to it. "How large is their fleet?" he asked. Doran hesitated, and that hesitation frightened the room more than any number could have. "Based on the sensor data from the border patrols before they were destroyed, we estimate between 1,200 and 1,500 capital ships, with support vessels numbering in the thousands," he said. "They fight with a level of aggression and technological brutality that the Concorde has not faced in 900 years. "And our combined fleet?" Solon pressed. 800 capital ships at full mobilization, which will take weeks to achieve," Doran answered, and his mandibles clicked in the Kethvori expression of grim honesty. "Even at full strength, I cannot guarantee victory." The room went cold. Species that had spent centuries competing with each other for trade routes and political influence now looked at each other with the shared terror of creatures who had just realized they were all standing on the same sinking ship. In the back of the chamber, in the seats reserved for minor civilizations, the human ambassador, a patient man named David Chen, who had perfected the art of being invisible, raised his hand. "The Terran Federation would like to offer its assistance," he said in a voice that was calm and measured and completely unremarkable. Several delegates turned to look at him, with expressions that ranged from surprise to pity. A Vathari delegate, one of Solon's allies, let out a sound that was the crystalline equivalent of a dismissive laugh. "This is a matter for civilizations with actual fleets," she said, and a few others nodded in agreement, because the idea of humanity contributing anything meaningful to a galactic war was to them slightly less realistic than asking the furniture to fight. Ambassador Chen nodded politely, as if he had expected exactly this response, and sat back down without another word. In the observation gallery above the council chamber, Captain Alara Jin watched the entire exchange through the reinforced glass, and she did not flinch at the insult, and she did not clench her fists, and she did not show any emotion at all. She simply looked at her watch. She was counting down, and the number was getting very small. Far away, impossibly far from the politics and the panic, and the proud alien voices arguing about things that would soon not matter. in a region of space where the gravitational forces of nearby stars canceled each other out and created a dead zone that no ship had any reason to visit, something was happening. It started with a sound that no one could hear, because sound does not travel in space. But if it could, it would have been the deep, resonant groan of metal expanding after a very long sleep. Power systems that had been dormant for decades began to cycle online, one after another, like a giant heart remembering how to beat. And deep within a mass of carefully arranged debris and ice and sensor-baffling materials, lights began to flicker in corridors that had been maintained in perfect readiness by a crew that had waited their entire lives for this moment. The debris field that had hidden the shape began to crack and fall away, and what emerged was something that the mind struggled to accept. A hull so vast that it defied the word ship, in the same way that an ocean defied the word puddle. 27 kilometers long, armored in plates so thick that they could survive the heat of a star, bristling with weapons that had never been fired in anger, but had been tested and retested and calibrated with the obsessive precision of people who understood that when the time came, there would be no second chances. A single navigation light ignited at the bow, a small blue point in the endless dark. Beside it, and then another, and then 100 more, and then 1,000, spreading down the length of the hull like stars being born along the spine of some impossible creature. The ship had no name painted on its hull where enemies could see it, because it had been built by people who did not believe in announcing themselves until the moment was right. But deep inside, on every bulkhead and every uniform patch and every coffee mug in every mess hall, 4 letters were printed in simple white text. TFS Erebus. And she was finally, after 130 years of silence and patience and hiding in the dark, awake. On the bridge, a space so large it had its own echo. An old man with gray hair and steady hands sat in the command chair and watched his displays come alive with the green light of full operational status, and he took a slow breath and spoke the words that 85,000 crew members had been waiting their entire lives to. All hands, this is the Admiral. Set condition 1 throughout the ship. Spin up the main drives and plot a course for Concord space, he said, and his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a century of preparation. It is time. And in the cold dark between the stars, the greatest warship ever built by human hands began to move, and the fabric of space itself seemed to shiver as she passed. The first sign that something impossible was happening came from a Concorde sensor station on the edge of the Marathi corridor, where a bored technician named Perel was halfway through his night shift and mostly thinking about breakfast. His console screamed. Not beeped, not chimed, screamed in the way that equipment screams when it detects something so far outside its expected parameters that it does not know what else to do. And Perel nearly fell out of his chair as every display in the station turned red at once. "What is that?" his supervisor demanded, rushing over with her coffee still in her hand. Perel stared at his readings and opened his mouth and closed it again, because the numbers on his screen were lying. They had to be lying, because nothing that large could exist and nothing that massive could move that fast. And yet his instruments were telling him that something 27 kilometers long was crossing the Marathi corridor at speed. Faster than light speed, and heading directly for Concorde core space. "It is either a small moon that has somehow developed an engine," Perel said slowly, "or the biggest ship anyone has ever built, and I do not know which answer frightens me more." Within the hour, 14 more sensor stations across 3 sectors reported the same contact, and the Concorde's communication networks lit up like a forest fire as terrified analysts tried to determine whether the Reshkari had built some kind of superweapon. But the energy signature was wrong for Reshkari technology. It was cleaner, more controlled, running on principles that the analysts did not immediately recognize, and its trajectory was not coming from the galactic rim where the Reshkari operated. It was coming from human space. Ambassador Solan was pulled from a strategy meeting by an aide who looked like he had seen a ghost, and when Solan read the intelligence report on his tablet, his crystalline skin shifted from its usual clear blue to a pale, almost white shade that indicated extreme shock. He called an emergency session of the Security Council, and for once, every single delegate arrived within minutes. "We have received a priority transmission from the Terran delegation," Solan announced, and his voice was carefully controlled in the way that voices are controlled when the speaker is trying very hard not to panic. "I will play it now." The holographic display in the center of the chamber activated, and a simple document appeared. No decoration, no diplomatic flourishes, just clean text on a white background, and it contained the technical specifications of a vessel designated TFS Erebus, Apex-class dreadnought, along with a complete list of its weapon systems, its defensive capabilities, its crew complement of 85,000, and its current heading. The room read in silence. The silence lasted a very long time. Made a sound like cracking glass, which was the insectoid equivalent of gasping in shock, and the room erupted. "This is impossible!" shouted the representative from the Draelith Collective. "No Tier 6 civilization could build something like this. The power requirements alone would exceed the entire energy output of their home system." "It is not impossible," Fleet Marshal Doron said quietly from his seat, and something in his voice made the room go still again. "I have run the numbers on the weapons loadout listed in these specifications 3 times in the last 4 minutes, and I need the Council to understand what I am about to say very clearly." He stood, and his compound eyes swept the chamber with the focus of a military mind that had just encountered something that rewrote every strategic calculation he had ever made. "That ship, if these specifications are accurate, could fight our entire combined fleet to a standstill," he said, alone. Silence that followed was the loudest sound any of them had ever heard. "How?" Solan whispered. "How did they build this without us knowing?" "Because we were not looking," Doron answered, and there was something almost like respect in his voice. "Because we decided 130 years ago that humans were small and unimportant, and we never looked again." Attached to the specifications was a single line of text from the Terran delegation. "Humanity requests permission to assist. The ship is already en route." Several delegates demanded that the vessel be ordered to turn back, that humanity be sanctioned, that inspections be conducted, and explanations be demanded. And they made these demands with the outrage of people who had just discovered that the quiet neighbor they had been ignoring for a century had been building a fortress in their basement. But others, the smaller species, the younger civilizations, the ones who had also been dismissed and overlooked by the elder races, said nothing and simply stared at the specifications with expressions that looked very much like hope. Meanwhile, aboard the TFS Erebus, Captain Elara Jin arrived by shuttle through a docking bay so large that it had its own internal navigation beacons. And she stepped onto a flight deck where hundreds of combat drones sat in perfect rows like sleeping birds of prey. A young officer met her at the airlock and escorted her through corridors that hummed with a deep resonant energy, the sound of a ship that was fully alive for the first time in decades. And they passed crew members who moved with the focused calm of people who had trained for this moment every single day of their careers. Some of them had been born on this ship and had never set foot on solid ground, and they had grown up knowing that their entire purpose, the reason the Erebus existed, the reason their parents had volunteered for a lifetime of secrecy, was for a day exactly like this one. Jin was taken to the bridge, and when the doors opened, she stopped walking for just a moment, because even though she had seen the blueprints and read the reports, nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. The bridge of the Erebus was the size of a cathedral, with a ceiling that arched high above, and massive display screens that showed the stars outside in such perfect detail that it felt like standing in open space. And at the center of it all, sitting in a command chair that looked like it had been designed for a king, was Admiral Konstantin Zhang. He was 74 years old, with gray hair cut short and eyes that had the steady, patient look of a man who had spent 30 years waiting for something and had never once doubted that it would come. And when he saw Jin approach, he stood and extended his hand. "Captain," he said, "welcome aboard." "Admiral," Jin replied, shaking his hand. "We are coming, and they are not happy about it." "They will be," Zhang said, and there was no arrogance in his voice, only the simple confidence of a man who knew exactly what his ship could do. "When the Reshkari arrive at their doorstep, and they see what stands between them and destruction, they will be very happy indeed." He turned back to the main display, where a tactical map showed the Erebus as a single blue icon moving through space toward the Concorde warfront, and somewhere ahead of it, a sea of red icons represented the Reshkari Armada. 60 years to build her, Zhang said quietly, almost to himself. 60 years of secret budgets and hidden shipyards, and thousands of people who gave their lives to a project they could never tell anyone about, because we learned something in our very first contact with the galaxy. He looked at Jin with eyes that burned with quiet fire. "We learned that the universe does not care about fairness or kindness or diplomacy," he said. "The universe respects only one thing, the ability to protect what you love. And we decided, 130 years ago, that we would never be powerless again, that we would smile and nod and sit in the cheap seats, and we would build something in the dark that would make the galaxy think twice before it ever threatened us or anyone we stood beside." He sat back in his command chair and watched the stars stream past on the display. "It is time the galaxy met us properly," he said. And the Erebus drove on through the void. 27 kilometers of human determination and human patience and human fury held in perfect, terrible readiness, heading toward a war that the galaxy thought it was losing. The galaxy was about to discover that it had been wrong about a great many things, and humanity most of all. The Reshkari Armada arrived at the Vathari home system with 2,000 warships and the absolute certainty that nothing in the galaxy could stop them. Warlord Kael'zer had grown fat on victory, not physically, for the Reshkari were creatures of war, and their bodies remained sharp and terrible, but in his mind he had grown lazy with the ease of his conquests, and he looked at the 800 Concorde ships forming a desperate defensive line near the fourth planet, and felt nothing but contempt. Warlord Kael'zer had grown fat on victory, not physically, for the Reshkari were creatures of war and their bodies remained sharp and terrible, but in his mind he had grown lazy with the ease of his conquests. 812 capital ships, assorted support vessels, positioned in a standard defensive formation around Vathari Prime. Kael'zer leaned forward in his command throne, his four eyes narrowing with predatory focus. "Defensive formation," he repeated, and he made the Reshkari sound that served as laughter, a low, grinding noise, like metal scraping against stone. They fight the same way they have fought for 900 years, and they wonder why they are losing. He was about to give the order to attack when Thesik's console emitted a sharp warning tone. "Warlord," Thesik said, and something in his voice had changed. "I am detecting a new contact, a single vessel, dropping out of faster-than-light travel directly between our fleet and the Concorde defensive line." "One ship?" Kael'zer scoffed. "What kind of fool sends one ship?" "Warlord," Thesik said again, and this time his voice was barely a whisper. "The contact is 27 kilometers long." Every officer on the bridge of the Burning Tide turned to look at the main display. The TFS Erebus dropped out of faster-than-light travel like a mountain emerging from fog, and she did it, directly in the center of the battlefield, in the empty space between 2,000 Reshkari warships and 800 Concorde vessels. And for a moment, the entire system went absolutely silent. On the Concorde side, 800 captains stared at their sensors and tried to process what they were seeing. A ship so large that their targeting computers initially classified it as a space station, then reclassified it as a planetary body, then simply gave up and displayed a question mark. A Vathari cruiser captain whispered something in her native language that roughly translated to "What in the name of every star that ever burned is that thing?" On the Reshkari side, 2,000 warships came to a confused halt as their own sensors struggled with the same problem, and for the first time in the entire campaign, the Reshkari advance stopped. Admiral Zhang stood on the bridge of the Erebus, surrounded by officers who were calm and focused and ready, and he nodded to his communications. "Officer, open a channel," he said. "All frequencies, all encryption standards. I want every ship in this system to hear what I am about to say." The channel opened, and Zhang spoke in a voice that was broadcast to nearly 3,000 warships simultaneously. "This is Admiral Konstantin Zhang of the Terran Federation ship Erebus. To our Concord allies, we stand with you. To the Reshkari Dominion, you have one opportunity to withdraw, and there will not be a second." On the bridge of the Burning Tide, Warlord Kalzor listened to the human's words, and felt a flash of rage that burned through his veins like fire, because no one had spoken to him with such calm authority since the last civilization he had broken, and he would not tolerate it from the species he had dismissed as insignificant. "All ships," Kalzor snarled into his fleet-wide channel, "concentrate all fire on the human vessel. Everything we have, kill it and break their spirit." 1,000 Reshkari warships opened fire. The barrage was staggering, a wall of energy and projectiles and plasma that turned the space around the Erebus into a storm of destruction so intense that the light from it was visible from the surface of the nearest planet. And any normal ship, any ship that had ever been built by any civilization in the history of the galaxy, would have been vaporized in the first 3 seconds. The Erebus shuddered. Barely. "Shield status," Zhang said calmly. Chief Engineer Mara Okafor, a woman who had spent 26 years maintaining the most powerful warship in existence, and who referred to it as the Old Lady with genuine affection, checked her readouts and responded without looking up. "Void shields holding at 94%, she said. "They are going to need bigger guns." "They do not have bigger guns," Zhang replied. "Return fire, all batteries." The Erebus spoke. 14 primary mass driver batteries fired simultaneously, and each one launched a relativistic slug, a projectile accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light, that crossed the distance to the Reshkari fleet in less time than it took to blink. And when those slugs hit their targets, the results were not explosions so much as erasures. A Reshkari battlecruiser simply ceased to exist, replaced by an expanding cloud of superheated vapor, and then another vanished, and another, as the mass drivers cycled and fired with mechanical precision that turned capital ships into memories. 200 plasma lance turrets opened up along the Erebus's flanks, carving lines of burning light through the Reshkari formation like fingers drawn through sand. And where those beams touched, armor melted and hulls split, and reactors breached in cascading detonations that lit up the void like fireworks. And then the drone bays opened. 40,000 autonomous combat drones poured out of the Erebus in a swarm so dense that it looked like a living cloud. And they descended on the Reshkari fighters and corvettes with the coordinated fury of a hive protecting its queen. And within minutes, the smaller Reshkari ships were being torn apart by machines that moved faster than any pilot could react. On the Concord side of the battlefield, 800 captains watched in stunned silence as a single human ship did what their entire combined fleet had feared it could not. It fought 2,000 Reshkari warships, and it was winning, not slowly, not narrowly, but overwhelmingly, with a brutal efficiency that made the most hardened Concord veterans feel a chill run down their spines. Fleet Marshal Duran stood on his own bridge and watched the tactical display, and his compound eyes tracked the numbers as the Reshkari fleet count dropped. 1800, 1600, 1400, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Tide. Sub-Commander Fesick was shouting over the alarms and the explosions, and the screams of dying ships. "Warlord, we have lost 600 vessels in 19 minutes, he cried. "We must withdraw. This is not a battle. This is a slaughter." But Kael'zer was beyond reason, consumed by a fury that had curdled into madness, because he could not accept that a species he had dismissed as a footnote was destroying his armada, and he gave the only order his pride would allow. "All remaining ships, ramming speed, target the human vessel directly. If we cannot burn it, we will crush it with our bodies." 400 Reshkari warships turned on suicide vectors and accelerated toward the Erebus, and for the first time in the battle, the bridge crew of the human dreadnought felt a flicker of tension. Zhang watched the wall of ships bearing down on them, and he closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. And when he opened them again, his face held the expression of a man doing something necessary and terrible. "Prometheus," he said quietly, "authorized." Deep in the heart of the Erebus, in a chamber that only 12 people aboard the ship had clearance to enter, a weapon system that existed in no database and appeared in no specification sheet that had been shared with the Concorde came online. The Prometheus device fired. It did not look like a weapon. There was no beam, no projectile, no flash of light. There was simply a point in space, directly in the path of the 400 charging Reshkari ships, where the laws of physics briefly and catastrophically changed. A gravitational singularity, a controlled, temporary black hole, bloomed into existence like a dark flower opening its petals, and it pulled. 400 warships, each one crewed by thousands of Reshkari warriors, were dragged inward with a force that no engine could fight and no shield could resist, compressed and crushed and folded into a point of light no larger than a marble, which burned with terrible brightness for exactly 3 seconds before evaporating into nothing. Then it was gone, and so were they. The remaining Reshkari fleet, broken, scattered, reduced to a fraction of its former glory, did not need to be told to run. They fled to faster-than-light speed in complete disarray, abandoning formation and protocol and pride. And Warlord Kael'zer stood alone on the bridge of the burning tide and stared at his tactical display, which showed empty space where a third of his armada had been. And for the first time in his long and bloody life, he understood what it felt like to be prey. The Battle of Vaethori's Gate had lasted 1 hour and 47 minutes. The Erebus had taken no significant damage, and the galaxy, which had spent 130 years believing that humans were small and weak and barely worth noticing, had just received the most violent education in history. The Reshkari Dominion sent a formal ceasefire offer 46 hours after the battle, and it arrived not with the proud seal of Warlord Kael'zer, but with the quieter signature of Sub-Commander Fesick, because Kael'zer was dead, found in his quarters aboard the burning tide, with wounds inflicted by his own officers, who had decided that the warlord who had provoked the human Leviathan did not deserve to lead them into further destruction. Fesick negotiated the surrender terms with the cold practicality of a soldier who understood that his species had walked into a darkness they could not fight. And the terms were simple: full withdrawal from all conquered Concorde territory, return of all prisoners, and a non-aggression pact that would be enforced not by the Concorde, but by the unspoken promise of what the Erebus could do if the treaty was broken. The Reshkari agreed to everything, because they had watched 400 of their warships compressed into a marble, and there was no pride left that was worth testing that weapon a second time. With the external threat resolved, the galaxy turned its full attention to the question that now burned brighter than any star. What do we do about the humans? Ambassador Solon convened an emergency session of the full Concorde Assembly, not the Security Council, not a closed committee, but the entire body of 42 species, gathered in the grand chamber of Valith Prime. And when the delegates took their seats, the tension in the room was so thick that even the air recyclers seemed to struggle with it. "We have been saved," Solon began, and his crystalline skin pulsed with colors that indicated deep unease. "But we have also been deceived. For 130 years, humanity has maintained a military capability that dwarfs anything in the Concord arsenal, hidden from our inspections, concealed from our intelligence services, and operated in direct violation of the Transparency Accords that every member species has sworn to uphold." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the elder race delegations. "I move for immediate sanctions against the Terran Federation," a Dralith delegate announced. "Mandatory inspections of all human military facilities, forced decommissioning of the vessel designated Erebus, and a formal censure to be entered into the permanent record." Several delegates applauded, and for a moment it seemed as though the Concord would punish the species that had just saved it. Which, if anyone had been paying attention to galactic history, was exactly the kind of foolish and ungrateful thing that old empires tended to do. But then the representative of the Marathi, a small, quiet species that had been a Concord member for only 200 years, and had never once been asked its opinion on anything important, stood up and spoke in a voice that carried surprising force. "You want to punish them?" she said. "You want to dismantle the only weapon that stood between the Reshkari and the extinction of every species in this room. You want to sanction the people who came to save us when we had spent a century telling them they did not matter." The chamber went quiet. "The humans did not attack us," she continued. "They did not threaten us. They did not demand territory or tribute or surrender. They simply appeared when we needed them and fought a battle that we could not win, and now you want to take away their sword because you are afraid of how sharp it is." Other delegates from the younger species began to stand, one by one, and the political landscape of the Concord shifted in real time as the smaller civilizations, the ones who had also been dismissed and overlooked and seated in the cheap chairs, rallied behind a species that had proven what the overlooked could accomplish. Fleet Marshal Duran, who had watched the political maneuvering with the detached analysis of a military mind, requested a private meeting with Admiral Zheng before the assembly reached its vote. Old soldiers met in a small conference room aboard the Erebus, a room that was plain and functional, decorated with nothing except a star chart and a photograph of Earth seen from space, and they sat across from each other like chess players who had just realized they were not actually playing the same game. "I have a question," Doron said, his compound eyes studying the human with the intensity of someone trying to understand a puzzle that had been sitting in front of him for 100 years. "Ask it," Zheng replied. "How long have you had this capability?" Doron said. "Not the ship specifically, but this level of military readiness. How long have the humans been capable of what I saw at Vathorai's gate?" Zheng considered the question and decided that the time for secrets had passed. "Since before we joined the Concord," he said simply. Doron processed this, and his mandibles clicked slowly, the Kathvori equivalent of a long, thoughtful pause. "Exhale. You could have dominated us," Doron said. "You could have revealed the Erebus at any time in the last century and demanded whatever you wanted. Territory, resources, political control. With that ship, you could have made the entire Concord kneel." "Yes," Zheng agreed. "Then why?" Doron asked, and for the first time, the great fleet marshal of the Concord Combined Fleet sounded not like a commander, but like someone who genuinely needed to understand. Zheng was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his words were chosen with the care of a man who had thought about this answer for 30 years. "Because that was never the point," he said. "We did not build the Erebus to conquer. We built her to make sure we would never have to kneel. Not to the Concord, not to the Reshkari, not to anyone. There is a difference between having power and using it to dominate. And we chose to keep ours in the dark until someone needed saving." Paused. "We wanted to be left alone to grow and learn and become what we were meant to become. And we wanted the assurance that if the galaxy ever turned hostile, we would not be helpless, he said. We did not want to rule, we just refused to be ruled. Duran studied the human for a long time, and then he did something that no HFY fleet marshal had done in the presence of a foreign officer in 400 years. He inclined his head in a gesture of genuine respect. You are a frightening species, he said. We know, Jane replied, and for the first time, the old admiral smiled. The Concord Assembly voted the following day. Captain Alara Jin, who had spent 130 years' worth of accumulated human patience compressed into her own quiet career, stood at the podium and addressed the gathered species of the galaxy, in a voice that was steady and clear and carried no anger. Humanity does not want an empire, she said. Not want dominion over your worlds, or control over your resources, or a throne at the center of your politics. We want a seat at this table, a real seat, not the chair in the back that you gave us when you decided we were too small to matter. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates who had ignored her for years. You spent 130 years treating us like children, she said. We spent 130 years making sure that if the darkness came, we could face it. The Erebus will not be dismantled, but she will not be aimed at any of you. We are not your enemy. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made even the eldest delegates lean forward. But we will never again be your afterthought. The vote was not unanimous. Some elder races would carry their fear and their wounded pride for generations. But the majority carried, and humanity was elevated to Tier 1 status within the Galactic Concord, the first species to achieve that rank in 400 years. In the days that followed, the galaxy began the slow and uncomfortable process of recalibrating everything it thought it knew about the quiet little species from the third planet of an unremarkable star. Archivist Ewan, who had spent 15 years on Valith Prime pretending to study old records, while actually building the most comprehensive intelligence network a human had ever operated in alien space, walked the corridors of the station and listened to the whispers. The Vathari whispered about human patience and what it meant that a species could hide something that enormous for that long. The Kekvori whispered about human military doctrine and quietly began requesting joint training exercises. The smaller species did not whisper at all. They spoke openly and with admiration about the humans who had proven that being underestimated was not a weakness, but a weapon. Smiled and kept walking, passing a wide observation window that looked out onto the orbital docks where the Erebus sat at anchor. 27 kilometers of dark hull and sleeping weapons, patient and vast, like a dragon resting with one eye open. A group of alien children on a school trip were pressed against the glass, staring up at the impossible ship with wide eyes and open mouths. And one of them, a young Vathari girl with skin that shimmered like morning frost, tugged on her teacher's sleeve. Were the humans always this strong? She asked. The teacher, an older Vathari who had lived through the panic and the battle and the vote, and the slow dawning realization that the galaxy would never be the same, looked down at the child and hesitated. Yes, she said finally, and her voice was quiet and honest. We simply refuse to see it. The child looked back at the Erebus and pressed her small hand against the glass, and the ship sat in the dark. Beyond, silent and immense, and it said nothing, because it did not need to. Far away, in the cold spaces between stars, in gravitational dead zones that appeared on no chart and existed in no database, other shapes sat in their own carefully constructed shells of debris and ice and silence, smaller than the Erebus but no less dangerous, no less patient, no less ready. And slowly, silently, one by one, their navigation lights began to wake.